Hello, everybody. This is the Pick Six Podcast. Sam McKewon along with Jimmy Watkins. Evan Bland is on vacation. Jimmy and I have just gotten off of vacation. Hello to everyone. Jimmy, how are you?
Good to be back in the U.S. of A, Sam. Good to be back.
Jimmy was up in Canada for the 4th of July, although Windsor, Ontario is a pretty American version of Canada. You wore the Canada glasses last week, right?
I did. And we were doing it big.
You guys recorded that podcast, if I'm not mistaken, literally hours before USC and UCLA joined the Big Ten.
I believe we had stopped recording at like 10 minutes before the news broke, or it might have even broken at the tail end while we were recording, and I just wasn't looking at my phone. So those are the best kinds of podcasts to record. And it's a shame because I think we did a fun one, but
it was fun.
I don't think that anyone cared about the information that was being discussed at that time anymore.
The information expired pretty quickly because
that happens.
It does happen sometimes. USC and UCLA are in the Big Ten now. They'll join the league in 2024. We will talk about that in the back half of the podcast. I have lots of thoughts. I haven't written much about it at all. We'll have a little bit more in a Monday Rewind. I've had some conversations with people, both at Nebraska and then also in just sort of the conference industry. Even though I've been on vacation, I've had a few of those conversations off the record, so on and so forth. And so I do have some thoughts about where things will go from here, and certainly Jimmy has some as well. We are going to start, though, with Nebraska football recruiting. It's a natural place to start because we are actually roughly at the halfway point of the cycle. Now, you can say to yourself, now, wait a minute, the cycle ends in mid-December, and you're only, basically 5 months out from that. What are you talking about? Well, reality is you don't do a lot of forward cycle recruiting before the second signing date, which is always in early February. And of course, people know that was 5 months ago. There used to be a time when you do a lot of, forward cycle recruiting in that January to February period. It's died down a little bit because you have the transfer portal. And so there's a lot of recruiting being done of players from other schools. And so you're really somewhere closer now on almost like a 10-month cycle, even though, again, there's lots of recruiting being done in that, late December, January, early February process. Maybe you're adding a few players to that cycle. But in reality, you're kind of closer to a 10-month thing. And after the official visits in June, there's a natural stopping point. A lot of the coaches kind of go on break. They're going to be back relatively soon. And then there's a week in late July when you can host visitors again. We'll see if Nebraska does that. I'd be kind of surprised if they do, because they're going to start training camp the day after they're at Big Ten Media Days. So Scott Frost will be at Big Ten Media Days, and they're basically going to start training camp because obviously they're playing in week 0 in Ireland. We can talk a little bit about Ireland. I didn't get a ton out of the Zoom call yesterday that I watched on replay, but I wanted to talk definitely about recruiting. Nebraska is, again, at sort of a midpoint. They had a really good June. 13 commits overall in the class. They've gotten a whole bunch since the official visit started in June. There's a couple of decisions still outstanding. One of those was resolved yesterday when Amir Herring committed to Michigan. By the way, we're recording on a Friday. And another one of those will be resolved here in a few hours when Caden Green announces his commitment, and I'm pretty confident that he's going to be committing to Oklahoma. So I think we're going to be at 13 overall commits for through the weekend. I don't anticipate there being anything imminent that I'm aware of. I figured Barry Jackson and Omarion Miller and Dylan Rogers would commit, and once those guys went off the board to Nebraska, that there might be a few days sort of in between, but I guess we'll find out. Jimmy, I know that you've been in and out of recruiting a little bit. Obviously, you handle basketball recruiting a lot more than football. But as you look at this from sort of an outside perspective looking in, how do you feel like Nebraska's done?
Well, we talked about this a little bit on the pod last week, and I kind of feel like I'm sort of exactly where I was, which is I think that Nebraska has good recruiting momentum right now. The work that the new guys have done, Mickey Joseph, Bill Bush, and the like, is impressive, is promising. The Omarion Miller commit is a great get. A lot of smoke around Malachi Coleman still. Those guys are big time players to grab for the program. Obviously, Maverick Noonan was a great get, but it's still like it's still a results based business. The recruiting portion of this has not really been the problem for Frost's staff. Like they've held their own. Now they've been on the bottom half of the Big Ten recruiting rankings for most of his tenure, but the Big Ten is a monster, so that's not, you got to grade that on a curve, right? But for the most part, they've recruited talented guys. What we're waiting to see what the difference needs to be here is the retention and the development of those guys. So I don't want to say that I'm dismissing everything that happens during the recruiting cycle, because as I said last week, to some degree, perception is everything in recruiting, and getting these guys to campus, getting them to commit matters. But I'm still stuck in this. We're still all kind of trying to figure out this new world with the transfer portal being as popular as it is. So it's great to get all these commits. It's great to build all this momentum, but it matters more to me, both in terms of changing the trajectory of the program and in terms of retaining these guys. Both things that Frost has struggled with during his tenure. I just don't know how much stock to put into this stuff. I need to see wins. I need to see some of these guys with high recruiting pedigrees pan out in Nebraska football uniforms. And we need to see all that coalesce into victories.
That's fair.
It's a boring answer, but
no, it's not a boring answer. I'm going to push back in a couple of areas here really quickly. The first area I'm going to push back in is the idea that recruiting hasn't been the problem. Actually, I think it has to some degree. It hasn't been the problem, obviously, from a recruiting rankings perspective. And I still think that the 2019 class was very, very solid. And a lot of those players have stuck around and have panned out. And even some of the ones who transferred, you can't argue with Wan'Dale Robinson's production when he was here. And you sure as hell can't argue with what he did at Kentucky. So Wan'Dale Robinson was a good recruit, even if he only was here for 2 seasons. But some of the other classes, I think, have been a little bit of an issue. The one that comes up right away and is immediate is that 2020 class, where it felt like very late in the process, Nebraska goes out and signs a bunch of guys from Florida that didn't know a ton about the school and hadn't spent a lot of time really involved relationally with Nebraska. And then a lot of those guys just subsequently left. You have a pretty big chunk of that class that has already departed. It just didn't seem to be a group of players that were necessarily, I don't know what the right word is, into Nebraska. Some of them had really lofty recruiting rankings, but a lot of those guys were not necessarily deeply tied to the school. If you go back and look at that, I'm looking at the 247 composite rankings. They had 26 signees that year. They had the number 20 class in the country. Turner Corcoran is still here. He was the highest rated player according to 247 composite. The next ones are Xavier Betts, Keyshawn Green, Marcus Fleming, Henry Gray, Omar Manning, Nadab Joseph, Jaden Francois. Now, out of that group of players that I just named, the only one still here is Omar Manning. So, and Turner Corcoran. And so a lot of the top players there, I just don't know that they had done the absolute best homework on whether some of those players wanted to be here or not. A lot of junior college players in that class already gone. Jordan Riley, Feldarius Payne, Nico Cooper, who was there for like 1 year. So it just wasn't that successful a recruiting class. I think they added a lot of guys late. I thought in 2021, there was a real lack of momentum going into that class. And so I thought it was okay. And then the 2022 class was limited to some degree because they took so many transfers and because there just didn't seem to be a ton of momentum. And so I kind of like the 2021 class more. And then the 2022 class, we'll see. I think there's a lot of late additions on that class too that I don't love. But we'll see. We'll see. But if you look at that 2021 class, I'll just rattle off the names. Thomas Fedoni, it's not his fault. He's been hurt, but he hasn't played. Wyndon Huahuli is gone. Teddy Prohaska, obviously. Radanoff Kapai, Henry Lutovsky, James Carney, Ruquan Buckley, Heinrich Harburg, Makai Bayer, Latrell Neville, Kobe Bretz, Camonte Grimes. There weren't a lot of contributors right away. And there were a couple of guys who have already left the program, actually left it relatively quickly. And Malik Williams, Branson Yeager didn't even make it to the beginning of the season. So there's a lot of work to do, I think, in that class too. So I think that's been part of the issue.
Okay, well, can I interject real quick?
Yes.
Like, as for the 2021 and 22 classes specifically, there's a lot of circumstantial context that I think that plays into that, right? So 2021 is the recruiting class that you basically have had the least amount of time to put into, right? You can't for part of that, for COVID class, you can't get guys on campus, you can't see them in person. Like, that stuff is really hard to manage, and no one had ever done it before. So I'm not saying that's like a complete pass, but it is something that needs to be considered. And then last year, there's this noise about, is the coach going to keep his job? And he ends up firing his entire offensive staff. Like, it's hard to recruit under those circumstances, is it not?
Yeah, it is. I think there's no question about that. The question that's naturally comes up about this class that just came in is, again, a lot of these guys just didn't have a lot of time with the program, and they'll just need. You're just kind of wondering how well it's going to go. That's probably the best way to put it. There's talented players in that class, but again, their contact time with Nebraska is very limited. So there's not a lot of guys that necessarily had been committed to the class for several years. Ernest Housman, probably the one that you're most interested in terms of, he's really been committed to Nebraska for a long time. We'll just see. I like classes that are built over time, where like Maverick Noonan is a good example of somebody who really knows Nebraska's football program inside and out at this point. We'll see. We'll just have to see.
I think there's a philosophical divide at hand here too, right? Where, like, there are sort of two ways to look at building a recruiting class, and that is stars, go out, grab talent first, second, third, grab as many guys. Like, don't worry about counting position numbers, especially in the transfer portal era. Just grab as many guys you can get, put them in practice. Hopefully that familiarity breeds competition, that talent breeds competition. And then there's the slow burn that has, I think, traditionally been, when Nebraska was great, that's what they were doing. That when, that's just how recruiting used to work in general. It's a changing landscape. So I find that to be fascinating, because I think the correct answer used to always be slow burn. I don't know how feasible it is to do that consistently anymore.
I think you can get the guys that you want, that you feel like fit your program, and simultaneously aren't just a star rating. And I think multiple coaching staffs at Nebraska have struggled with the star rating thing. Like, the Riley staff did too. They signed some guys that were real iffy fits and hadn't really visited the school. And some of that has happened under Frost as well. What I do like about this particular class, to bring it to the 2023 group, is as far as I know, every single guy that's committed has taken an official visit. And I think that's a good thing. You don't always see that. But these guys have spent their share of time around the program. Some of them have been here multiple times. William Watson, Pop Watson, he did commit, without having that official visit yet, but he's had that now. So he has a very good sense of the program, and he was also here in the spring. You just go down that list. Dwight Boodle committed before he had taken his official visit, but come on. I mean, he knew everything about the program because his brother played here. So he had been around the program for 5 years. Omarion Miller didn't commit until he came here. Riley Van Poppel the same way. Jaden Doss, Maverick Noonan knew everything about the program. Sam Sledge hadn't taken his official visit yet, but he had been down here for years with his dad. So there's a lot of names in there. And even the one was interesting to me was Hayden Moore came on an unofficial visit on his way out to a different official visit in early June, and just came through to see it. And then based on that, made an official visit date, then came on that, and then committed a couple of days later. And so I do feel like Nebraska's process of recruiting is a little bit better. They're getting guys who have been exposed at the very least to 48 to 72 hours of constant Nebraska programming, pros and cons, player input, all of those things. My understanding of the way that the recruiting process is being run now is it's much more organized. It's much more put together. It's not just sort of slapped together or haphazard, but it has a form and a function. And there's a really solid presentation there. I think that was attractive to transfers too, but I think it's been good for the recruits. And with maybe the exception of a running back, I can't really. They've gotten everybody I thought they would get, and maybe one that I wasn't sure that they would get. So I think they've done pretty darn well. I think going into May, if we're just going to be talking, just going into May, I'm not sure that Maverick Noonan was a lock for Nebraska. Coming out of his official visit, though, he pretty much was. And so that was positive. I think that was a really big get. And then I think everybody else that they got, I think that was pretty surprising. I think that was pretty expected. The one question mark that I have is the running back position, which we'll get to in a minute. But I just like the way that they've gone about it. I like the teams. I don't pay too much attention to star rankings until they're in like the top 100, because recruiting services will sometimes hand out a haphazard 4-star, Jimmy. That's just my experience. One scout sees it. Oh, wow, he was there the right day, and it just gets a haphazard 4-star. No one is inside the top 100 haphazard ever. Like, that group of players is discussed a lot, and it's guarded. And so if you're in the top 100, just about everybody thinks you're a really good football player, and Amari Miller is. And so, the top 100, I kind of look at that way. But then after that, I kind of look at the offer list. So I kind of look at the other teams that are recruiting them, and seriously recruiting them, not the I got an offer from them and look at that. And I think the offer lists have generally been pretty good. Like, I like the other teams that have been in on some of these guys. And so I kind of look at that, and it seems like a solid group to me. I love the Mav Noonan commitment. Amari Miller, we'll see. I think he's got a lot of talent, a lot of potential, a lot of physicality. I love the Riley Van Poppel commit too. Riley Van Poppel is going to be a good player at Nebraska. Very quick off the ball, very aggressive. Will fit in well in this league. I think the offensive line commits are decent. They need to go out and get another tackle or two. And then they still got to find a couple corners. But I think for the most part, they're off to a good start. What's interesting to me is they're 32nd nationally, according to 247, but they're only like middle of the pack in the Big Ten. It's legit. The teams in the Big Ten used to be very average in recruiting when Nebraska joined the league, and then Urban Meyer came in, and that changed everything, because Urban Meyer changed the conversation around recruiting. He ruffled some feathers at the time, but now everybody recruits at a pretty fervid pace. Everybody's a pretty good recruiter at this point.
Yeah, and that goes back to the point I was making earlier, where the stars aren't going to separate you in this conference, right? Like, it's just everyone's loading up on super talented kids.
Unless you're Ohio State. Then
okay, yes, right. There's about 5 or 6 of those type of programs in the country, and it's really hard to become one of them if you're not already one of them. But for the most part, even said that, it's hard to even separate yourselves from the rest of the Big Ten. It's just the base level of competence, the floor, whether it's recruiting or football in that league, is just so high. That's why the little things matter. That's why the process stuff that you're talking about matters, because those are what separates you when everyone's pretty much dealing with a similar deck of cards. To your point about the guys who have left, I think that's another feather to the point that I was talking about earlier. All the guys that you named from the 2020 class who have already left. You could argue that's a did you do enough homework thing. You could also argue it's once you get those guys on campus, what did you do with them thing. And that's why I'm still kind of shrugging at everything they're doing right now. Even if their process is better, even if they're doing more homework on these guys, even if they have better people in place to do it, it doesn't matter if they don't turn these guys into productive on-field players, or, you know, convince those players that they're doing the best things for their development track, and then they leave in a couple years. So we're still navigating such new ground that the conversation around recruiting, it's still a 24/7 thing, but I think we have to keep more of an eye towards the bigger picture now, because there's no guarantee that any of these guys are going to be here in 3 years.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think there's a couple of positions where you're going to start to see people say, well, you know, it's almost easier to go to the transfer portal and get a player like this than to go to high school, because once you get them in the portal, then they can't transfer right away. And I think corner's one of those. I think wide receiver will probably end up being one of those. And I think running back might be one of those. Much harder to get these edge rushers. I know Nebraska got a good one, but I don't know that they'll be able to repeat that. Much harder to get an elite offensive tackle. Everybody needs one. Much harder to get an elite defensive lineman. I think Nebraska got a pretty good one in Devin Drew. Stephon Wynn is not proven by any means. He's been with a good program, and good for him, but you know, he didn't contribute a lot to those wins and losses per se. So he's got something to prove in coming to Nebraska. I think there's positions that are easier to go into the portal and find players than there are others. Simultaneously, you know, Nebraska's only had a few players leave that you would describe as players who went on to do something big somewhere else. One of them early in the Frost era was Avery Roberts. He went to Oregon State and had a nice career there. Wandale Robinson is another. Luke McCaffrey doesn't appear to be that guy. He's at Rice right now. We'll see. But a lot of the guys that have left, honestly, Jimmy, were players that just weren't probably Big Ten football players. That's just the best way to put it. A lot of them were defensive backs, guys that haven't gone on to do a ton at their future schools. And then Maurice Washington, I forgot him. I always forget him. Maurice is a different case. Certainly talented enough to play anywhere in the country, to be honest with you. He's going to play at Grambling, I believe. And I'm looking forward to seeing how he plays there. But Maurice was a different case. But a lot of these players who go to other schools, they don't play at a Power 5 school. And so I think Nebraska at times would evaluate based on, I'm not sure what guys that could get stars. And they just didn't necessarily get the right guys. And so I think they're trying to do a little bit more, make sure they get the right guys, be aggressive where they can, lean on relationships. And then again, you look closely at those offer lists and you think about it. I'm always skeptical of getting a kid from Iowa who doesn't have an Iowa or Iowa State offer. Always skeptical of getting a kid from Oklahoma who doesn't have an Oklahoma or Oklahoma State offer. Why wouldn't those schools want him? That kind of thing. And so I think they're doing pretty well. I've been relatively impressed. Omarion Miller's, again, has the potential to be a really, really good player, but we said that about a number of receivers that have come to Nebraska. And, you know, outside of Stanley Morgan, a lot of the high school guys have not panned out the way that everybody hoped. J.D. Spielman kind of did. Of course, he left too. So, you know, we'll see. What's left to get? Another offensive tackle. Those are hard to get. Another edge rusher or two. Those aren't easy to get. Another defensive lineman. Hard to get. A couple of corners. Maybe they go into the portal for that. I don't know. There does come a point where if you don't get the corners you want, you shouldn't go out and look for corners that just to add them. You know, to be very honest with you, Nebraska's done a little bit of that. You know, they've added some guys. You're like, and then the guys leave. They're not fits. So I don't think you overextend yourself there. I think you try to be judicious. And if you get to December and you don't have any of those, well, you always got the portal that you can kind of look into. I don't know. Are you a big like when you think about the diet, right? So like the way that Nebraska should fill its roster, what do you think the ideal balance between transfer and high school kid is?
I think, well, I think it's sort of we don't have a super long track record of comparing the two. I think in general, and maybe this is just because this is how it's historically been done, I would lean towards high school kid, because culture and infrastructure and leadership, all that stuff, I think matters a ton. Again, like we were talking about earlier, I think those little things, when you're dealing with mostly the same deck of cards, particularly in the Big Ten West, there's not a ton of separation between the kind of kids that Nebraska has and the kind of kids that Iowa has. Those little nooks and crannies are where you can separate yourself. And I think it's just easier to build that sort of stuff when you have guys in the program for 3 years who learn from other guys who were in the program for 3 years. And then the transfer portal is like, the sprinkle, the cherry on top, that sort of thing. It's like, okay, we missed here, or we feel like we're light here. Let's go grab a dude, like Kane Williams, who has the pedigree, who went to Alabama, and we like his talent, that sort of stuff. I do think it's sort of like basketball at this point, though, where like it's unrealistic to say that you can ignore the transfer portal and win games, because there are always going to be unforeseen circumstances, whether it's a guy who has a huge year and declares for the draft earlier than you anticipated, or it's an injury, or a guy who thinks he can do better somewhere else and hits the portal. Right. So you have to fill those gaps somehow, and I think the transfer portal is a great tool to do that. It's like we've talked about a lot about this with basketball. Abdul Masih used to compare it to the draft and free agency. And I think for the most part, particularly in football, the prevailing school of thought is build your team through the draft.
No question.
Pop it off through free agency.
Yeah.
That's how you build a winner.
Yeah. I don't know if that's true in the NBA.
The NBA is a little bit more complicated.
The team that's won the most NBA titles in the last 10 years built it. Their best players they drafted.
Sure. It's a little bit more complicated in the NBA. I mean, I wonder if both in college football and college basketball, we might see these trends repeat of like guys who played AAU together, or guys who knew each other from all these, whatever star Elite 11 camps. They build a relationship and they think, well, what if we all teamed up? That would be awesome, especially as we now move towards maybe we're not quite at the super conference level yet, but we're building towards that. There's going to be these talented players are going to cluster even more so than they already do. They're going to because I mean, like, let's be honest, if you're in the new Big 12, whatever that looks like, you're at a severe disadvantage because all the elite programs are in 2 conferences and you're not one of them. So I think that we could see, it's an interesting trend to monitor, some of these guys teaming up and using the transfer portal to get where they want to go and play with their friends like NBA stars have done. But I think that's harder to do in football just because of the numbers involved. There's a lot, there's fewer guarantees for playing time, and the coaches have more, the players have less autonomy in that sport. There's just more going on in football, which makes it harder for that to happen.
From the recruiting front, I'll still be curious to see what Nebraska does at running back. They have a ton of running backs on the roster. Some of those running backs are going to leave after the season. They might even leave before the season. You just never know. There is a guy that committed to Kansas State, Dylan Edwards, who I really think is going to be a good player in college. Nebraska, I think, tried there. He committed to K-State. Then another guy, Dontavius Braswell, who's built more like many of Nebraska's running backs, including Anthony Grant. He visited Nebraska, visited South Carolina, visited Boston College, had it put out a top 4 that didn't include South Carolina, then committed to South Carolina. I don't know. I wonder if they go back out and try to recruit Edwards a little bit more. He's good friends with Jaden Doss, who was one of the wide receiver commits. You wonder if Doss would go to K-State or if Edwards would come to Nebraska. I just feel like that recruiting process could be still kind of interesting. And we'll see where it falls. Let's talk basketball recruiting for just a minute. on the men's basketball side of things, how many scholarships does Fred Hoiberg have in his back pocket? Do we know? And who are the top names? Who are the guys they're going after?
The scholarship thing is quite honestly exhausting to keep up with. It's a fluid situation. They have the roster that they have right now with the 2022 guys. They have a core intact. We're talking about guys like Ramel Lloyd, Jamarcus Lawrence, Blaze Keita, Wilhelm Breidenbach, CJ Wilcher, guys that I feel pretty confident are going to be in the program and have significant roles in the program going forward. After that, the college basketball, more than anything else, is shuffling through. You're going to have huge turnover, it seems like, every year at a lot of these schools. I'm starting to just comb through the Big Ten as the dust settles for 2022 right now, and it's just like the in and out list are very long. So to your point about the top guys, I know Fred Hoiberg is out on the road this week. He's paying close attention to Price Sanford, the brother of Peyton Sanford, who plays at Iowa, who Iowa has big expectations for going into next year. He has an Iowa lean, according to the recruiting websites. When I talked to him, it sounded like he was a little bit more open-minded about Nebraska. But as I've said before, I don't know if it was on this podcast or on the radio, there has never been in the history of official or unofficial visit recaps a negative review of the visit. It's just how it works. So I would still think that Price Sanford is going to Iowa, particularly because he wants to decide this fall. And I think one of Nebraska's best arguments would be to have a promising season, right? And to reverse the trends that they have struggled with in the early portion of the Hoiberg era. Another guy Fred is going to see is Parker Frederickson, who was committed to Oklahoma State, decommitted, is still getting a ton of offers, but Nebraska has been in on him very early. He played a tournament here in Lincoln, 1 or 2 months ago. Nebraska had a strong presence at that tournament. His family is from Nebraska. They have been to a bunch of Husker games. They're huge Husker fans. I want to say, don't quote me on this, I think his dad has Husker in his Twitter account name. I think I remember seeing that, but the point is they're huge Husker fans. I know Adam Howard will be hitting the southern part of the United States, North Carolina, South Carolina, Atlanta, that region. Also, fun fact, his family is still in Alabama. He's going to drive them back up here. So he's still maneuvering that move. But one guy that's to watch there, I just should mention that Parker Frederickson, Price Sanford, both 4-star kids. Another 4-star kid that they are hot on and that has included them in his top, I think it's a top 6, is Trey Green, who is a very undersized point guard. He's not 6 feet. I believe he's 5'10". He's super quick, super skilled, 4-star kid who plays for, I believe it's Link Academy in North Carolina. So I know that Adam will be visiting him this week during the live period. The interesting thing about a lot of the guys that we're mentioning right now, those are the guys who are furthest along in their decision-making process right now, I would say. There's a stark contrast between the kind of team that Nebraska is building for 2022, which is size, length, big, defense, and the kind of guys they're recruiting for 2023 right now. Parker Frederickson, all high school kids are skinny. That kid's really skinny. He's 6'4" and not even 200 pounds. He's a lanky kid. Now, again, I think that if your biggest concern about a recruit is you need to put some meat on those bones, I don't think that you should put a ton of stock into that, because you're going to be in a D1 weight training regimen. You're going to be eating whatever food you need to be eating. Like these are, you have professional people that can take care of this stuff. But he is undersized bulk wise. Price Sanford is the same way. He's a skinny kid. His brother's a skinny kid.
That's common to basketball players, so
for sure. But I mean, like, and there's this school of thought that says it's harder for taller kids to put on weight in the weight room. That's more reserved for like big men. Like for some of these other kids, like it's just interesting to see the guys that they've brought in for immediate production, as opposed to the guys that they're looking to ahead of the game. And that goes to, Chase Clemens, the kid that they have, the one kid that commit that they have in the bank already. He's 6 feet tall. I think he does a lot of stuff that you need to be good at to succeed at the Division I level when you're 6 feet tall. He's fast. He's under control. He's got great ball handling skills. He's got good vision. He's got a good floater. He can shoot over guys, quick release. But you're still 6 feet tall in the Big Ten. That's interesting. Trey Green is the same way. He's not yet 6 feet tall. So I just think that's an interesting contrast. And this, again, we're one commit into this class. There's a ton more offers to be sorted through. There's going to be more guys entered into this class, and there's going to be transfers in this class. But I found that to be interesting, and it's a skill play over a grit play. Again, guys that they brought in last year: Blaze Keita, Sam Griesel, Emmanuel Bandamel, Jawan Gary. Jawan Gary is not a guy who I would say is the most skilled basketball player. He shot sub 30% from three at Alabama. He's not a great ball handler. He just is a bull, as Bandamel described him yesterday. He'll hit you and then he'll jump over you to grab rebounds. He's a guy that's going to do the dirty work. Parker Frederickson is a shooter, capital S shooter. He's got some shake to his game. I don't think he gets enough credit for his off the dribble stuff, but he's a shooter. Trey Green, skill. Chase Clemens, skill. It's just an interesting contrast to me.
It is. By the way, Link Academy is in Branson, Missouri.
Okay.
The reason I know that is because Nebraska's Karan McPherson played there.
So, okay, but Trey Green is from North Carolina.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, we'll see what happens. I mean, it could be, and you've mentioned this before on podcasts, Nebraska basketball kind of needs a break. They need a couple of these freshmen to really pan out.
Yeah.
And then not leave, for the
right.
NBA. But they could really use, maybe Lawrence and Denham Dawson and Ramel Lloyd are above average, and they just don't really need a lot of additional recruits. They got these three guys. They're all pretty good. They decide to stick around. Maybe you have those guys for 3 years and you're not always going out and looking for another person because you feel like you got the guys in-house that can win you basketball games. One of these years, Nebraska's going to have a group of recruits like that, and it'll alter the way that they, recruit subsequent classes because, they won't have to replace players. They'll just have the guys that they want. Speaking of basketball, so one of the things I'm going to write a little bit in my Monday Rewind is, one of the most striking things that I remember, I've been to UCLA a couple of times, but one of the most striking things I remember about UCLA when I went there for the NCAA tournament back in 2014, women's basketball tournament, is that arena is the nicest arena I have ever been in my life. I don't know if you've been in it. Yeah. Yes. So, it was renovated, I don't know, 10 years ago, something like that. And it's just a palace. It's gorgeous. It's a really pretty arena. It's not huge, but it's the prettiest arena I've ever been in. And you're from LA. So I think you understand more about that city than a lot of people do. But where UCLA is located, you can go about 4 miles one way and you're in Beverly Hills. You go about 1 mile another way and you're in Bel Air. You go 1 mile another way and you're in Riviera. You go through Brentwood, which people remember if they remember anything about the 90s. And then you go another way and it's where all the movie premieres are, which is right down at Fox Westwood Village there. It's basically the richest place on earth. I mean, and there are other places in the world, I get it, that have a lot of money. But I would describe that part. It's basically the richest place. Rich in a lot of ways, not just money, but culture and all these other things. That city and there's 2 schools in it basically came to the Big Ten and said, we want to join your league. And even though they may not have said this consciously, but subconsciously, and give up control of the league that we're in. We will never control the league that we're joining, ever. Ever. It belongs to the East Coast schools, or those old school, Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State, those old, standby schools in the Great Lakes area, and USC and UCLA from Los Angeles, maybe the greatest city in the world, wanted to join that. I'm thinking to myself, that's the most mind-blowing thing to this whole thing, is that those two schools wanted to join the Big Ten. Big Ten did not court them. Big Ten did not put a full court press on them. Those two schools wanted to join the Big Ten. As a Los Angelino, which you are, how surprising was
that? I mean, given the dichotomy between what the Pac-12 is, what Los Angeles is, and what the Big Ten is, it's a culture shock just to think of USC and UCLA as Big Ten schools, as you alluded to, where they come from and where all these other schools come from.
Yeah.
Don't look like. The way their football teams want to operate when they're operating at their peak don't look like what anyone besides Ohio State in the Big Ten wants to do.
Right.
It's weird in that sense. It's not weird in the sense that if you're paying attention, when you this all started, this you could argue, people have been one of the popular, and I don't know why it's been popular, but people have been trying to pinpoint where this whole realignment thing started. Was it when Nebraska went to the Big Ten? Was it when the Southwestern Athletic Conference disbanded, all that sort of stuff? The big one, when Texas and Oklahoma went to the SEC, that signaled a game of musical chairs. Like, hey, there are the haves and the have-nots in college football. That's where all this is going. Maybe it's all going to be one conference one day, but right now it's looking pretty clearly like it's going to be two big dogs. And the phrase that Trev Alberts used last summer was, ironically, when he was discussing the Pac-12 Big Ten alliance, he said he wanted Nebraska to have a seat at the table. He wants them to be involved in the reshaping of college football. We all accept that college football is going to look very different in 10 years than it did 10 years before today. And Nebraska wants to have a piece of that pie. USC and UCLA saw the same things that Trev Alberts saw, and they're like, okay, we got to get in somewhere. Like, if that means we have to relinquish control of our conference, cool. We just want to be at the big dogs table. And that's what I think motivated this move. I think that it's a game of money and power now. Maybe it always was to some degree, but it's abundantly clear that's what it is now. It's two TV networks sort of pulling the puppet strings from behind the scenes, and it's ESPN and SEC in one corner, and it's the Big Ten and Fox in the other corner. If you aren't on either of those sides, you're in a weird limbo purgatory situation. Like, the USC UCLA move was a really, really bad day for an Iowa State, a Kansas State, a Cincinnati, who thought they were moving up in the world by joining the Big 12 in the first place. So I think the musical chairs analogy is what I'll come back to. There are only so many seats that are going to be at this table. And USC and UCLA recognized that and said, we got to be there. We don't know what it's going to look like, but we want to be at the negotiating table, at the big dogs table, at the teams who get serious consideration for the college football playoff table. That college football playoff already is disproportionately SEC Big Ten. It's going to be way more that way now. That's why that happened.
That's good stuff. I appreciate that. One of the things that I think I think there's probably a couple of different stories here as it relates to the schools, why UCLA and USC, joined the Big Ten. For UCLA, it is to some degree a pure money play. UCLA has $102.8 million in debt, their athletic department. They're not going to be able to pay that off in the Pac-12. They can't. And there does come a point where, and UCLA has an additional issue of that. The time to cut a bunch of sports was about 15 years ago, and they didn't do it. You can't, it's almost impossible to do it now because, and it's not entirely impossible, but it's very hard because any movement toward doing something like that will attract the attention of the national media, who then go to Twitter, who then howl and cry. And I'm not trying to knock the national media, but it's true. They go to Twitter and they howl and cry about cutting these sports and how can you do these to these kids? I don't know what world they inhabit, but there's no longer a real world approach to these things. Like UCLA can't just go and cut 12 of its sports, and they have a lot of sports that, to be clear, don't make any money. Like, and they don't not make money. They don't make any. Or
and to be clear, nothing besides football and in some places basketball makes any money in college.
No, they don't make a profit. There are schools, there are sports, there are some sports that don't make any money.
Okay.
They don't bring anything in, or very little. Let's put it that way. I haven't looked at UCLA's bottom line, but they've got sports. And the other thing is out there that they don't have the interest in college sports out there the way they do here. So, their programs might be really good, but UCLA volleyball doesn't get 9,000 fans. It gets 1,000, if that. So there's a challenge. There's lots of different challenges there that are one thing. And I think UCLA is tethered to that way to USC. And so there's a little bit of a money play there. And I think that's a factor. But I think the larger issue is that, over the last 10 years, since we've gotten the college football playoff, the sport has siloed in a way that it isn't really about even the leagues, but it's about a handful of teams. The teams that are consistently putting themselves in playoff contention and then also make the playoff. And none of those teams reside in the Pac-12. And for many years, for 2 years or a couple of years, those teams have not resided in the Big 12 either. There's one team in the ACC, and that is Clemson. And they fell off the mark last year, and we saw what happened. There is one team in the Big 10, maybe two, right? Ohio State and Michigan. Michigan State's also made the playoff. And then there's 2 or 3 in the SEC. And it's almost like in a game of Risk, having the biggest properties on the map, the biggest parts of the map. The key, it's almost like landing on Boardwalk or Park Place. And the reality is Pac-12, the USC was going to have to lead that league to a playoff berth. They've only had 2, I think. Oregon back in 2014, and then Washington a couple of years later. But they've only had 2. They haven't had many, they haven't had any since Washington. USC was going to have to drag the league to the playoff. And once they got to the playoff here and expands to 12, the Pac-12 might have gotten 1 team, maybe 2. It was gonna function like a group of 5 conference. Whereas the Big Ten is going to get 2 or 3 teams, and Ohio State kind of leads the way. And Ohio State is the reason that I think the Big Ten went back to the table for football back in 2020. I think it's the reason that the Big Ten season, although greatly imperfect, wasn't so screwed up that they couldn't get a team to the playoff, which they did. And then you look at the Pac-12 back in 2020, and granted, they were to some degree having to follow the local health directions and local health orders of some of the places out there, which wasn't always easy, but it was a disaster. I mean, the whole season was a complete disaster. USC might have been the best team in the league, and they didn't get to play for the league championship. Or maybe they did. I can't remember. But it was just that whole year was just a complete disaster for for the Pac-12, and I think it made it clear that it was gonna be a mess going forward. Actually, yes, they did. USC did get to play in that championship game. I'm trying to figure out which team basically didn't get to. Yes, that's right. They weren't able to. Washington was not able to play in the game. Technically, Washington should have been in it, but they didn't have enough players because of COVID and so on and so forth. So, like it just feels like kind of a messy situation out there as it was for the whole time. And I don't know. As you look at the reasons why those schools might have come to the Big Ten, I think it's broader than just money. And I think the Big Ten, in accepting those schools, the presumption then was, as you've kind of said, we're going to have all these dominoes. We're going to have all these domino effects where we're going to have these 20 to 24 team leagues. That's possible. But the only way that's possible is if the networks deal those teams in. Because as it stands right now, Notre Dame is really the only property left that is going to increase the value for the TV network. Everything from here on out is probably a losing proposition for the TV networks. And the TV networks would have to desire to deal teams into the league. In other words, we are now accepting the reality that in adding this team to the league, we're simply adding that team to your league so that we can get to a number that makes sense for us on some other level, which I don't even know what that would be. Unless you have in-season tournaments in the Big Ten and the SEC, then I don't know how you do. I don't know what you're going to add by adding teams. If you get above 16, okay, you take Notre Dame. What is the value of getting to 20? What is the value of getting to 20? I don't know.
I'm not talking about everyone being at 20 to 25. I think what we're moving towards is just one big Death Star. It's going to keep getting pared down, and there's going to be a certain, the premier 20 to 25 teams in the country, maybe a few less than that, are eventually going to just for Alabama, Ohio State, Michigan, LSU, Texas, USC.
How are they going to get out of their contracts? How will they?
Well, I'm not saying it's not immediate. I just think this is a step towards that in 10 to 15 years.
So a professional league, but
that there's going to be there's always evergreen frustration with the NCAA, and they're seeing how much power that they have as brands to make dollar signs go up. And I think that, again, college sports, whatever you thought college sports was before, it's money and power now. And that way to maximize money and power is to rid yourself from whatever rules you need to follow, quote unquote, follow with the NCAA.
Right.
Whether to, I don't know, take a different angle on this. I don't think it's that interesting. Okay, we can do this real quick. I don't think it's that interesting to talk about whether it's good for Nebraska. I think it's a short answer. I think it's yes. Nebraska is firmly in the in category. The music has stopped temporarily for one round. Nebraska has a chair. 2 thumbs up. I think they actually have an outside chance if we go to the Death Star one conference thing. I think they have an outside chance to be included in that too, because their brand recognition is powerful. They bring viewers in. They bring eyes in, and they have a runway. What's missing is they have a runway to prove that they can compete with some of these teams. If they average 4 or 5 wins over the next 5 years, I don't think they're going to be in that conversation. If they average 7, 8, 9, I think they could be. Whether it's good for the sport as a whole, I think is more nuanced, more interesting, because I think there's 2 schools of thought there.
Sure.
I think there's 2 types of football fans in the world. There's college football guy who's a huge loser in all of this. Obviously, rivalries are being ended. 100-year rivalries are being ended. You're losing pageantry. You're losing all the fun sideshows that make college. It's not all of them, but some of the fun sideshows that make college football really fun. You're losing this. I don't know that this was ever that real, but there was 10 years ago when or how long ago was this now, when Boise State beat Oklahoma? 15 years ago, 25 years ago? I don't know. 2005. That was peak G5 madness. Oh my God, these teams deserve a chance. We just had Cincinnati in the college football playoff. That stuff's really fun. I think it's going by the wayside. with these sorts of decisions. You might get one a year if the college football expands to 12, but those 12 team playoffs are going to be filled with a bunch of 2 and 3 loss SEC and Big Ten schools, in my opinion. So I think that dream is dead for the most part. There's also a person who just like, I think this is close to me, like NFL guy, just likes high quality football. I want to see the best teams play each other every year. Right. And I think from that slant, you're getting a huge win out of this arrangement, because USC, Ohio State on a regular basis, like that's awesome. These are games that, like Texas, Alabama on a regular basis, that's awesome. These are games that you get excited about under the current structure, or I guess I should say now the old structure. You're excited when those schedulings get announced for 2035. Oh man, I can't wait to just see those 2 uniforms on the field at the same time. That stuff is cool. We're going to see it more often now. The talent is going to be funneled in more into those programs. We're going to see some really high level football at the sacrifice of some of the stuff that made college football fun and quirky. So I don't know however you feel about that. That's what it is now.
I don't know that it can go to a super league. I mean, unless the super league is 64 teams, then I could see it divided up into, 16, whatever. I could see that. I can't see that happening anytime soon because the conferences are what they are. But I could see 64. I don't think it would be smaller than that because, as you know, I think there's 32 teams in the NFL, but those 32 teams are not all clustered in one spot. And one of the challenges with a college football super league is how are you going to pitch this television market of Georgia and Auburn and Alabama and Tennessee and LSU and Florida State, and they're all in this tiny little, pocket of the same group of people. Whereas in the NFL, they don't have a cluster like that. They're strategically located in the mostly the largest markets plus Green Bay for a reason. There's an effectiveness to spreading it out. A 32 team league probably does favor somebody like Nebraska, because you do not want the 32 teams to all be south of Lincoln, Nebraska. You don't want it to be no teams west of Norman, Oklahoma, and only 2 teams from the north, and Michigan and Ohio State, and then everybody else from the ACC and the SEC. That's not a marketable product. So I don't know. I could see a super league being like 64, something like that. I do think that, hindsight being 2020, one of the gambits that they were trying to pull last year, I think the SEC was trying to negotiate a playoff, an immediate change in the college football playoff while adding these 2 teams at the same time, and then using the national media to get all hot and bothered when the Big Ten and the Pac-12 and the ACC put a stop to it. Like it was a pretty clever gambit by the SEC. It just didn't work. It fell short because they felt like they had to add Oklahoma and Texas before they got their little playoff push through with the extension ESPN. I think the fact that there's multiple TV networks probably makes this a little bit harder. And I also think that there's a kind of inventory that's going to be in place that's going to make it more challenging. But, that's possible. We could have a unifying theory. We live in a culture of unifying events and unifying philosophies and conspiracies and systems that are completely flattened, and so that we can systematize and make it easier. In my experience over the last 15 years, this conversation about trying to streamline and make everything flat has actually created more silos than ever. And so I don't know what will exactly happen. My sense is that the leagues will probably survive for some time, at least as long as I'm in the industry. And then, we'll see. What I would say is that the Big Ten doesn't need to add anybody above 16 unless it's Notre Dame. And if they get to 17, they don't need to add an 18th team. They don't need to have Stanford. They don't need it. It's just
could you argue that maybe they could shave like a Rutgers, something like that?
No, I don't think that they would be kicking anybody out of the league. Nope. I don't anticipate that happening. I just don't anticipate that happening. I think it would be, you'd have to get everybody involved and everybody'd have to agree. And, and if that were the case, then I think Nebraska would be a team that people would look at and be like, well, not in a big market, very popular, fans love them, but, hey, they tried to sue the league and all this other stuff. But no, I don't think you're going to see anybody get kicked out of the league. That said, I think it's good that Trev Alberts is the athletic director. I do. I think Nebraska went through a period of time where from the time that the Moose was hired until the time that he left, where I just don't know that all went that well. There's just between him and the league and all this other stuff, calling out teams, saying that they're afraid, and going to the Big Ten media days and demanding that, we don't want to play Ohio State and Michigan all the time. And then the comments that were made by Frost, and then suing the league, the players kind of suing the Big Ten, although everybody kind of knew that was put together by Nebraska. It wasn't put together. I mean, the kids didn't just come up with that exactly on their own. All those things. Like, it was just, Nebraska can thank Ohio State for a lot, because Ohio State gave Nebraska's concerns words and cover. Nebraska would have been very isolated by the media and by the rest of the league had it not been for Ohio State's desire to win national championships. There's just no other way to put that. Ohio State is Google. Alabama's Apple. Clemson is, what's the name of the big company? Which one am I missing? Facebook. That's what these are. Ohio State could not bear to not compete for a national championship. They couldn't bear that. Couldn't accept not being just dropping out of a season. No, they were going to do that. Everyone else in the Big Ten would have done it. Every other power school. Michigan was not going to do it. Michigan was going to punt. Ohio State alone kind of kept that thing alive. And, people can thank Justin Fields too. Like, he was part of that too. And I think on some level, if the Big Ten had punted and they had waited, well, the Pac-12 would have waited in some other schools, and it would have relegated the Big Ten and the Pac-12 to like sort of a secondary league. It just wouldn't have been the same thing. So I think that's part of why we're here now. I think that's part of why the USC and UCLA are in the Big Ten, because the Big Ten fought in that moment to keep playing. And they did. They finally got on the field. I don't know what USC and UCLA would have done otherwise, but the payout's going to be tremendous. I think every school will get over $100 million. When people talk about, well, what about UCLA and USC traveling? Does anybody know how far away Pullman, Washington is from Los Angeles? They weren't driving. Yeah. And Jimmy, you probably know the geography of California a little bit better than me. But would they have driven to any school? I don't think so, other than each other.
Yeah, I mean, the drive up to Stanford and Cal is about 5-6 hours. So I think with the money that's going into those schools, they're probably flying everywhere.
Yeah. And by that, when we say there, we're talking about their softball team. We're talking about water polo. We're talking about all of it. Yeah. Unless they were seriously on a bus for 6 hours, like a minor league baseball.
I'm pretty fascinated to see how that stuff works out. I mean, people are saying, how's this going to work logistically for, X non-revenue sport? The answer is that the Big Ten doesn't care. I wouldn't be, I'm still waiting to see like whether or not a sport like softball or water polo or whatever, what if they just make some sort of side agreement to keep playing the schools they were already playing? Because I could see how that would be prohibitive for some of those smaller sports, the logistics of the travel and everything. I don't know. I don't know about that one. I want to see more there.
I think that's reasonable. I think the closest trip is 6 hours, which again wouldn't seem to me to be a bus event anyway. So they were flying anyway. this wasn't a, you know what I mean? So they have a men's and women's water polo team.
Right.
At UCLA.
Yep. It's a major sport out west.
Yeah.
In California.
Rowing. Well, there's some rowing teams in the Big Ten, though.
Mm-hmm. Beach volleyball.
Volleyball. There's teams in the Big Ten that do beach volleyball. So that's really the only outlier there. I mean, water polo is not. That's the one where they don't have as many sports as Stanford. Mm-hmm. Stanford's got a couple. I don't think other schools have. Anyway, so let's say they go with a pod. Let's say it stays at 16 teams by 2024. The conventional thought was Nebraska would be in a pod with Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Iowa. Does the addition of USC and UCLA change that? I think it does.
Why? Because my answer would be I don't know. I'm not the scheduling. My scheduling brain doesn't work like that.
Hard to see. You know, I thought about this initially. I thought, well, could USC and UCLA be paired with Northwestern and Illinois?
We're just talking strictly because of the geographic position of these schools.
Well, you fly into O'Hare, you know, it's a big airport, but you don't. But I mean, they're going to fly charter anyway. They'll fly just directly to sites.
Right.
I don't know. I could see a scenario in which, you know, the teams all get a little bit different, and that USC is playing some team all the time that gets them, you know, travel back to wherever, and that UCLA is playing a team all the time, and they aren't necessarily playing all the same teams. That UCLA draws the team X and USC draws team Y, and neither one of them draw Michigan or Ohio State as an annual partner. But they alternate between those two. You know, 2 years USC plays Ohio State, 2 years UCLA plays Michigan, and then you swap. I could just see a scenario where UCLA says, hey, we want to play teams in the central time zone because we don't want to go 3 time zones. We don't have to. And we would rather play in the central time zone. So here are the options that we would like.
Another interesting football aspect of this, we've talked on this podcast about how Scott Frost wanted the Big Ten to adjust to him, and he's kind of had to come back to the middle a little bit on that.
Oh, yeah.
USC and UCLA play a lot like Scott Frost wanted to play when he first got to the Big Ten. I don't think USC will be forced to adjust out of that. I think that Lincoln Riley situation is going to work out really, really well. They're going to bring in a ton of big-time recruits. I think they'll be one of the best teams in the Big Ten within, 5 years. Okay. UCLA is a fascinating team to watch in terms of their football identity. I mean, Chip Kelly is basically on a year-to-year situation here. That football program could look entirely different in 2 years.
Good. What I'll say about, I think both teams will struggle to stop the run when they get in the league. They'll struggle with the physicality of it. And Lincoln Riley, I think, is going to have to think really hard about how he wants to build that program and how he wants to build a program to win a national championship. Because there's a lot of widespread thought of, well, he left Oklahoma because he didn't want a part of the SEC. And now USC is going to be in the Big Ten, and it's not quite as tough as the SEC, but it's up there. And, I think it's been somewhat proven that Lincoln Riley's teams don't do that well when they have to play, those kind of games. Oklahoma looked pretty pedestrian at times last year, even against Big 12 teams, but they looked kind of pedestrian against Nebraska. And I think Nebraska was just a big physical team that ultimately didn't win the game, but was able to take some things away because they knew how to slow down an offense like that. And Oklahoma's defense didn't always get off the field. And so, I think there's going to be a big adjustment there for USC and UCLA, especially as it relates to how you handle the physicality over the course of 3 months. It's not just one game anymore. It's November 15th and you're, at Illinois.
It's raining.
Cold.
It's raining. Yeah.
And you just played Michigan, and, all the handling the physical abuse. I think that part will be tough for them. I saw Rutgers and Maryland really struggle with it. I saw Nebraska struggle with it on the defensive side of the ball. I think UCLA and USC will have to have an adjustment. Their players will have to adjust. And the other thing is a lot of kids that stay out on the West Coast stay there because they want to play on the West Coast. They don't want to deal with that kind of weather. And now they will have no choice.
Well, they do have some choice. They don't have a ton of that weather in the SEC.
Right. They could go to a different league. Yep. Those kids could choose not to go to UCLA or USC. They could go somewhere else. I don't know if it's going to affect USC or UCLA's recruiting because there's a lot of kids in cold weather states who are really good football players, but I guess we'll find out. It is no longer a West Coast program. It can be a West Coast program, but it is going to have to compete in a Midwestern league. All right. That is all the time that we have for today with Jimmy Watkins. I'm Sam McKewon. This is the Pick Six Podcast. We will be back next week. I think it'll be just you and me again, Jimmy. Maybe we'll add a couple other conversations to it. We'll talk a little bit more about just turning the page toward the football season. It's coming, and we'll talk a little bit of volleyball as well. So for Jimmy, I'm Sam. Thanks for listening.